Hello to our marvelous viewers. What better way to count down the days for Halloween than some spooky scares from Netflix? The popular streaming service is home to a range of heart rate spiking shows and movies which are sure to make you feel the chill. Between Netflix originals and licensed titles, the sheer volume of works from the horror genre can be quite overwhelming to navigate. You can choose between classic pieces like Hitchcock's Psycho and new age acclaimed movies like Geralds Game, something for every horror fan. Granted, not everyone may find these movies equally scary. Some of these can be somewhat comedic. Nevertheless, the experience is sure to be entertaining. Imagine this. Fall is setting in, and there's the light rustle of crunchy leaves outside. A chilly wind is blowing in through the crack in the window, and you're putting on your favorite sweats and blanket and dimming the lights, getting ready to end your day or begin your weekend with some good old adrenaline rush. If this is what your pre-Halloween ritual looks like, well, go no further, for we've curated a list of some of the top horror movies available on Netflix right now. Let's dive right into it, folks. Oh, and this video will contain spoilers, so if you're yet to check any of these recommendations out, please skip that section. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Now, this is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. The Wailing, 2016. Southeast Asia is home to a plethora of amazing cinema, and after the critical and commercial success of Parasite, more and more people have started exploring works made in South Korea, China, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand, and so on. South Korea in particular has a very rich culture of horror cinema. The Wailing revolves around a policeman who, in an effort to save his daughter, investigates a series of deaths and illnesses. A strange Japanese man arrives at the remote village of Kuksong in South Korea, and very soon, the villagers become plagued with a mysterious illness that makes them go insane and kill their families. A local police officer named Jong-gu realizes that his daughter has been infected with the same mysterious disease and tries to find a way to help her. He meets a woman who tells him that the Japanese man is actually a demon who's responsible for the entire situation. Jong-gu enlists the help of a deacon who speaks Japanese and tries to find the stranger, thinking that his leaving will automatically make the illness in the village go away. As the daughter gets worse over time, he contacts a shaman named Il-gwang who confirms that the Japanese man is a demon and tries to perform a ritual. However, it remains incomplete, and soon the stranger is tracked down and finally killed. Jong-gu's daughter's health also improves for a while. However, the twist in the plot comes with the shaman claiming that someone else is the demon and that they're still alive. Jong-gu is now at a crossroads because he doesn't know who to believe. In the end, he makes the wrong choice and suffers the consequences. While the movie is pretty open-ended, originally there was another ending which was later deleted from the movie. This actually serves to explain the featured ending in a better way, but it was probably an executive decision to leave the ending somewhat ambiguous to let the audience interpret it in their own ways. The Wailing received immense success domestically, with a kind of mixed reception from abroad. One of the main reasons why some audiences didn't appreciate it was because of the long runtime. Many people have mentioned how the pacing is extremely slow, and not the kind that builds up suspense and keeps the viewers on the edge of their seats. There are also some ill-timed comic moments in the film that didn't appeal to an international audience, although some critics agree that could have been a lost-in-translation thing. Although the overarching theme of the movie is undoubtedly horror, there also seem to be elements from other genres that can sometimes make it too complicated or overly suggestive. Many people also didn't appreciate the open ending and wanted something a little more conclusive. However, that's all there is to criticize about the movie. In truth, The Wailing is a genuinely well-made movie. Director Hong Jin-na constructed the plot very carefully with veiled elements of satire, which sort of justifies the long runtime. The blend of East Asian elements of shamanism with components like exorcism and zombification actually helps bring fluidity to the movie, making it palatable to all audiences. A lot of people especially appreciated how South Korea was actually portrayed in the film, which is a welcome respite from the glitz and glamour usually associated with Korean media. The rustic setting enhanced the scary elements, and the cinematography has been particularly lauded. One of the overarching themes in the movie is how, at times, no one has any answer to the question, why me? Something bad happens. The dilemma of choice and having to suffer the consequences of making incorrect decisions is also something that stays with the viewers. Lastly, the movie also highlights Korea's colonial past under the Japanese occupation, although this is extremely veiled. Psycho, 1960. Probably one of the greatest horror movies of all time, Psycho is an evergreen favorite. It's also one of the earliest works in the slasher film subgenre. While the overt portrayal of deviant behavior made this film a subject of a lot of criticism right after its release, it's now become a cult favorite and is undoubtedly something every horror fan needs to watch. The movie shows a real estate secretary named Marion Crane stealing $40,000 from her employer as she wants to get married to her boyfriend Sam, whose debts are preventing the event. She drives to his place, but is forced to make a stop due to extremely heavy rainfall. She decides to spend the night at Bates Motel, which is just a few miles away from where Sam lives. The owner is Norman Bates, a man who lives with his old mother, and they have an argument about Norman wanting to have dinner with Marion. As they talk, he's asked to institutionalize his mother, but this greatly aggravates him and he claims she's just a harmless old lady. Marion decides to return the money the next day and showers before bed. In the iconic scene that follows, she's killed by a shadowy figure. When Norman discovers this, out of fear, he places her body in her car and ditches it in a swamp. Later, Marion's sister Lila arrives at Sam's place to ask about her sister's whereabouts. A private investigator is appointed to retrieve the money. This man realizes that Marion had probably last been seen at the motel and tries to speak to Norman's mother, is then stabbed to death. As Lila and Sam try to unearth the truth, they arrive at the motel and realize a horrifying secret about Norman Bates. While the duo survives, they learn about some other deaths that had taken place earlier. The portrayal of cross-dressing and intimacy shown in Psycho was considered pretty taboo when it was released. Initial reviews of the film were not very bright, with many critics speaking harshly about the subject matter. Some religious communities even dubbed it as morally objectionable. However, there was some positive reception too, and people called the film disagreeable, but at the same time, flawless. This movie has also been called the first psychoanalytical thriller of all time, with the violence and sex depicted here has never been done before in mainstream cinema, probably anywhere in the world. Anthony Perkins did a brilliant job in the movie, and it was fairly surprising how he didn't earn an Academy Award nomination for the same. The work he put in to portray a deeply troubled man is absolutely commendable. The cinematography and the themes of psychoanalysis, sexual deviance, and Freudian elements have been contested by many critics, but no one can deny that the brilliance of the film is how Hitchcock managed to blend all of these perfectly. That being said, there are people who claim the movie is somewhat overrated, maybe because it was the first of its kind and showed things that no director ever attempted to. As such, if audiences from today watch the film for the first time, well, it somehow becomes painfully clear that the motel is where everything will go wrong. The second half of the film is also sort of fillerish. Then again, judging Psycho from the lens of 2024 may not be the best thing to do, because this was released during a completely different era, and it certainly is trailblazing. It Follows, 2014. If you're looking for something that's diabolical and rousing at the same time, watching It Follows is the right way to begin your weekend. The movie deals with very subtle references of how a wanton lifestyle characterized by the meaningless pursuit of sexual desires can come back to bite one right in the behind. The movie opens with a girl named Annie Marshall running out of her home, apparently being pursued by someone, but when people opt to help her, she refuses being chased. She comes and sits by the bench and calls her parents, telling them she loves them. While all seems fine until this point, in the morning, her dead body is found on the beach, heavily mutilated. Later, university student Jay and her boyfriend Hugh go watch a movie, and the latter points to a lady following them. However, Jay is unable to see anyone, so Hugh panics. Later, the duo get intimate and Jay is incapacitated by Hugh, tells her that he's passed on something to her through intercourse, an entity that'll follow her at all times and can take the appearance of any person. If it catches up to her, Jay will be killed. He urges his girlfriend to have sex with someone and pass it to them. The police are later unable to locate Hugh. It becomes apparent that he was living under a false name. Soon enough, Jay notices strange people following her, can't be seen by anyone else, and in a panic frenzy, she decides to have sex with a neighbor who doesn't believe in the story. However, he's promptly killed by the entity. They'd located Hugh in the meanwhile, who had explained how the entity can be passed from one person to another through sex, and the cycle needs to go on for the current victim to be safe. A treacherous and completely problematic cycle of survival. Many critics believe that the entity mentioned in the film is symbolic of sexually transmitted diseases, which can be passed from person to person and can end up being fatal in many cases. However, the filmmakers have not explicitly said this is what they intended the real meaning of the entity to be, which would make the movie too puritanical. The depiction of sex is extremely thought-provoking nonetheless, and the title of the movie in itself does a wonderful job of explaining the events that happen in it. Some fans didn't like it a lot because compared to your regular horror movies, this one doesn't have a lot of jump scares or blood or gore. It's certainly creepy and suggestive, but it's also quite long and slow-paced for the plot, which becomes clear very early on. There's a lot of open-ended themes which are not addressed deliberately so that audiences can keep talking about the film and boost its popularity. That being said, It Follows is certainly a breath of fresh air and a somewhat respite from most horror films which deal with a lot of gore elements. It's clever, creepy, and just the right amount of paranoid, which makes viewers question the real nature of the entity and why it chose sex as the method of its transmission. Yeah, we agree that the film could have been shorter, but all in all, we're not complaining. The Babadook, 2014. The Babadook is an extremely acclaimed film made by Australian director Jennifer Kent. It's been dubbed as one of the most well-made works in the genre because of how it handles the entire understanding of the term horror. The titular entity is a form of the boogeyman, inspired by the Serbo-Croatian word for the same, Babadoga. The movie explores how Amelia Vanek, a young widowed mother to Sam, deals with raising the boy in the aftermath of her husband Oscar's premature death. Oscar had died in a car accident while he was driving Amelia to the hospital during her labor. The child, Sam, starts displaying eerie behavior and causes disruptions in school and socially, which perplexes Amelia. One night, he asks her to read him a book called Mr. Babadook. After a while, Amelia stops because of the disturbing content and its strange appearance. However, Sam becomes obsessed with the Babadook and believes it to be real. Amelia disposes of the book by ripping it off, finds odd things happening in her life, like finding glass shards in her food. Sam's violent nature only aggravates and causes his cousin to get seriously injured. Later, the book mysteriously turns up in front of their house, seemingly in perfect shape. Amelia discovers odd pop-ups of her killing their dog and finally killing her son. She later becomes possessed by the Babadook and gets violent to the point where the thing she'd seen in the pop-ups turns out to be real. However, the mother and son put in work to subdue the entity, but Sam says you can't get rid of the Babadook, implying that the entity is there to torment both of them for life. Why we said the take on the term horror is impressive is because this movie also doesn't have jump scares or body horror as such, which is what we see in almost every horror film. It doesn't bring in ghosts or other supernatural creatures or psychotic killers to reinforce the notion of horror. Rather, it takes the audience through a journey of self-discovery, where they have to face the fact that the real horror in life isn't what haunts us from the outside, but what torments us from within. The Babadook is a representation of grief and trauma that's not dealt with and simply tucked away. The film explores how Amelia and Sam were simply living each day without addressing the trauma that was certainly affecting them both on a very deep level, and when their shared grief finally breaks out, they both become unstable and violent to the point where they threaten each other's existence. The death of her husband is something Amelia had never come to terms with. She probably blames herself for being the cause of it. She also probably holds some unresolved anger towards Sam for partly being responsible for his father's untimely demise, which is in conflict with her natural motherly instincts toward him. Many critics have claimed that what Amelia was possessed by was nothing but borderline personality disorder, which was triggered by Oscar's death and her inability to cope with the trauma. She feeds off her self-pity and resents her child to an extent, and those negative emotions within her give birth to the entity known as the Babadook. Sam, on the other hand, is portrayed as a troubled and impulsive child, which is somewhat normal for kids his age, but deep down he's mature beyond his years and understands how unstable his mother really is. His attempts to build weapons against ghosts and monsters is actually an effort from him to shield both himself and his mother from their shared grief or trauma. The cast was absolutely phenomenal, a brilliant job of portraying the complex emotions of every character. While some critics were disappointed with the movie for not being scary enough, we think it was scary in the right proportion, but simply portrayed the genre through a different lens. Sam's words about how the Babadook can't be gotten rid of is a very grim truth, because grief and trauma can't magically vanish. They'll stay with people until the very end, but it's important to deal with them and cope in healthy ways. Otherwise, they can lead to people getting possessed by the pain and ultimately harm themselves and others. His House, 2020. When it comes to horror, most films are your run-of-the-mill family moves into haunted house trope. Yeah, it's certainly overused, but sometimes there are decent stories as well. However, something every viewer asks while watching these is, why do they just not move if the house is haunted? In His House, the trope is similar, but the audience can never really ask this particular question. Let's see why. Bol and Rial are Sudanese refugees who seek asylum in the UK. They have a perilous journey and even end up losing their daughter, Niagak, to death in the process of emigrating. However, when they finally arrive in the UK, they're granted asylum in a few months and are given a very shabby house to stay in on the outskirts of London. The house is not well maintained. The neighbourhood uses it as a trash dump and generally avoids it. The African couple experience intense racism, which is somewhat expected. Their only acquaintance is their caseworker, Mark, who asks them to abide by the strict restrictions or face deportation. While Bol tries to adjust to English society, Rial clings to the relics of her past and refuses to embrace new customs. Soon enough, they realize that the house is not normal and see visions of their dead daughter and a strange man vanishing into the walls. Rial says that the house is haunted by an apith or a night witch, and once the couple pay their debt to it, it'll leave them alone. Only they don't know what the debt is. Bol tries to look for another house, but to no avail. He then decides to face the apith all by himself, and things go terribly. He falls into a state of catatonia. The rest of the movie follows a flashback plot where Rial finds herself back in Sudan, and a plot twist is revealed about the couple, which couldn't have been predicted. The apith had told Bol that he claimed a life which was not his to take, and we see the true meaning of this statement in the flashback. As such, the couple decide to live with the ghosts of their past, quite literally, and continue their stay in the house. A lot of people were quite intrigued to see how the whole horror thing would blend with the elements of racism, refugee trauma, and survivor's guilt. Some people thought the film was too woke, but it didn't exactly portray any political commentary as such. It mainly focused on the consequences of violence and how displaced people have to adjust and create new lives as a result. The first half of the movie is brilliant. There are jump scares and the horror theme is at its best with the shabby and crumbling house. It's mostly creature horror, which gets a little boring after a point because the storyline becomes quite predictable. Critics have mentioned how the film transitions from horror to drama slowly, and by the end it becomes more of a scathing portrayal of the problems that plague refugees. However, there's no doubt that there were genuine moments of terror as well as moments that evoke gut-wrenching empathy for the displaced couple. Director Remy Weeks did a brilliant job with the screenplay, and the music is on point as well. The actors have performed their job sincerely and with enough emotion that the audience can actually feel their paranoia and guilt. If you're looking for some non-mainstream horror, well, His House will be a wonderful watch. Fear Street Trilogy, 2021. Every 90s kid is familiar with horror icon R.L. Stine, and this trilogy was inspired from his work. Directed by Lee Janiak, the Fear Street Trilogy is among the most popular teenage horror movies. The first movie of the installment deals with two towns in America located within close quarters, Shadyside and Sunnyvale. The former is known as the murder capital of the USA, which is considered one of the richest and safest towns in the country. These polar opposite towns are subject to a lot of legends, but the most prominent one is that of the witch Seraphia cursing Shadyside before being evoked in 1666, which resulted in the spree of murders and continues in the present. Dina, a teenager living in Shadyside, doesn't believe in the story and is seen breaking up with a closeted girlfriend Sam, who moves to Sunnyvale. Her brother Josh spends most of his time learning about the history of the town, while her friends Kate and Simon sell drugs to be able to leave the place. At a vigil for the victims of a massacre at the Shadyside Mall, students from both towns fight. As a result, a boy named Peter starts to chase the students from Shadyside. Dina tries to defend them, but ends up having a nosebleed, and Sam has a vision of the legendary witch. Later, the folks realize that undead versions of previous murderers have resurfaced and are out to kill again. Apparently Sam had bled on Fia's grave, and her blood had somehow resuscitated several murderers. They're all after Sam, so efforts are made to kill her so the murderers would go away as well. However, the solution is not as easy, as there's no escaping the witch and the curse she'd put on the town. In the second movie, Dina and Josh try to help get Sam back as she's possessed by the witch. They enlist the help of C. Berman, who's a survivor of the Camp Nightwing massacre from 1978. She narrates the entire story about the erstwhile massacre and how the witch Seraphia had sacrificed her hand to the devil to gain eternal life. The familiar rivalry between students of Shadyside and Sunnyvale plays a dominant role in this movie as well, as C. Berman narrates how many previously dead murderers were raised to kill again, just like the events of the first movie. The teenagers try to end the curse by reuniting the witch's hand with the rest of her body, but are unable to and die. Dina and Josh realize that they can do this now since they know where the body of the witch is buried, and they carry out the task. However, Dina gets a nosebleed and finds herself in the past, specifically in the year 1666, where she's now living as Seraphia. The third and last film is a decent conclusion to the story. It has two main parts, one that depicts the events of 1666 through Dina's vision, and one that shows the present. Dina realizes how unfair the death of Seraphia had been. Although there is a curse, it's not what the people think it is. In the core of the movie, there's homophobia, greed and gluttony, as well as a web of lies. After learning about the real truth, when Dina returns to the present, she realizes what she needs to do to undo the curse. It's also explained why Sunnyvale was a prosperous town, while Shadyside was always in ruins. As Dina and Josh embark on their mission to restore the order of things and free Sam from the possession, they almost get killed. However, just when the audience thinks everything is finally right, an ancient cursed object is found by a stranger, which points to how the events across the three films are likely to be replicated a second time. A fourth film is set to release soon, titled Fear Street: Prom Queen. The films have been received positively by most audiences, especially considering that the cast did a brilliant job with portraying each and every character. There's also a lot of appreciation for the queer element shown in the movies, which dates back to the 17th century as well as the present, and juxtaposes the entire narrative of the witch trials which had actually happened in the past. Women back then were considered witches and burned simply because of being intelligent or queer, or just different in some ways. While the opening premise of the trilogy portrays Sarah Fear to be this mad satanic servant, the viewers actually feel compassion for her later on. However, the queer portrayal was arguably much more poignant in the flashback scenes, mainly because of the time period issue. Fans have had a dispute over which of the three movies is the best, and while none of them are technically bad, the general opinion favors the second film. Of course, there's a lot more gore and blood in that one, which probably gives it an edge over the others. Critics have dubbed the first movie to be the weakest, as despite the good storyline, the horror elements were not really that scary at all. The third movie has a satisfying ending, but could have been so much more than that as well. The Platform, 2019. While this movie is also not your typical horror film, it's more of a social commentary on the inequality that exists in society, which actually becomes horrific after a certain point. The Spanish film is extremely well acclaimed due to its nuanced portrayal of a dystopian world where survival of the fittest is the rule. Gereng wakes up on level 48 and meets his cellmate Trimagasi, who explains how they're in a tower-like holding facility with apparently 300 levels. Once every day, food is lowered from a platform that starts on level 0 and goes all the way down to the lowest levels. People on the upper floors are eligible to eat as much of the food as they want within a particular time, while the ones in the lower floors have to deal with the leftovers. The people are reassigned to a new level each month, randomly. Gereng had opted to spend 6 months there in exchange for a diploma, while Trimagasi did it instead of serving a year-long prison sentence. The latter explains to Gereng how cannibalism is a common phenomenon in the tower, because people have to resort to killing and eating others when they have little to no food left. Throughout the movie, the two prisoners have to navigate life in the tower as they're moved to lower levels at random and come across more prisoners, who are both helpful as well as dangerous. They have to stay alive at all costs, but when it comes down to only the two of them, will their shared camaraderie win, or will hunger prevail? As mentioned, the horror depicted in The Platform isn't exactly monsters or anything supernatural. It's a commentary on human nature, begs the question, deep down, are humans inherently good or evil? What are the real lengths people will go to stay alive? The symbolism is intense with this one. The platform shown in the film itself is symbolic of the inequalities that exist within society. It's a symbol of hope for the prisoners, since it brings food for their survival, but at the same time, it's also their means of despair. People at the higher levels can eat as much as they want, while those in the lower levels have to scramble and resort to killing each other to survive. The theme of how capitalism and classism serve only the ones who have the means to survive is the main point of the plot. The movie also shows how unchecked power will certainly lead to corruption, because human beings are fundamentally incapable of being altruistic. While the ending of the movie was left to interpretation, critics have good things to say about the overall concept. It's in no way mainstream horror, but a more realistic kind of horror that leaves the audience wondering about the real nature of society. However, some people have said that the ending was too rushed, and it could have concluded on a more scary note. A sequel for the film was released in 2024, which deals with similar themes but tied up some of the loose ends. For example, Gereng makes an appearance towards the end, and the presence of the children in the tower is finally explained. You'll certainly not regret giving this movie your time. Creep, 2014. Patrick Brice's directorial debut, Creep, turned out to be a very well-written found footage film. The theme mainly revolves around psychological horror, as the titular character is a sort of serial killer. The movie shows a struggling cinematographer named Aaron, who receives an assignment from a client named Joseph, who has an inoperable brain tumor. His wife, Angela, is pregnant, and he wants to record a video diary, since he'll die before Angela will be able to give birth. Aaron arrives at the house, but is immediately turned off by Joseph's strange eccentricities and his confession that he'd raped his wife. When Angela tells him that she's actually Joseph's sister, Aaron attempts to leave, but is intercepted by Joseph. However, after a fight, he manages to get out. Coming back home, he goes to the police to complain about Joseph, but is unable to describe him and his house properly. He also ends up receiving mails from Joseph and gets stalked by the creepy man. Aaron. Finally, the two men decide to meet in public to make amends, but Joseph tricks and kills Aaron and takes the video of the entire incident. He places it next to the other videos of his previous victims and calls his new prey. Found footage horror is actually not easy to execute well, considering the cinematic moments need to be done extremely well. Creep does a really good job of maintaining a good pace and exploiting the attention of the viewers, all while framing Joseph's character in such a way that creepy becomes an understatement to describe him. It's the kind of film that'll keep the audience on the edge of their seats until the very end, and it also begs the question about human beings being inherently good or evil. The plot is innovative and does a good job of portraying just how much of a disturbing man Joseph is. However, despite receiving positive reviews, many critics have actually said that the film is extremely predictable. The elements of horror start out with a bang, especially when Joseph's eccentric side is revealed, but he turns out to be a regular homicidal serial killer. Not that being a serial killer isn't scary, but it's just a very overused trope. The director could have used the same trope, but been a little more inventive about the death of Aaron, which certainly felt a little anticlimactic. The jump scares are not very well done, and Aaron honestly comes across as a really mousy man who ignores obvious red flags. Yeah, we get it, he's struggling and needs the money, but the way the movie progressed, he had many other choices to make that could have ended with him not dying prematurely. But well, horror movie protagonists are rarely the epitome of intelligence. The cast does an amazing job at portraying the two equally odd characters, and that's one of the few plus points of the movie that critics have highlighted. As such, this is predictable, so if you're a hardened horror fan and want something light to watch, well, yeah, go for it. Geralds Game, 2017. Stephen King hardly needs an introduction. This movie is inspired by his book of the same name, and let's just say, this is a kind of horror you've probably never experienced before. There's a number of themes in this film that, when blended together, have created the perfect scare cocktail, which will linger in your mind long after you've finished watching it. Jesse and Gerald arrive at a lake house for a romantic getaway and to repair their strained marriage. On the way, they encounter a stray dog, who Jesse later gives some steak. When they enter the house, Gerald leaves the door open behind him, and Jesse undresses into a slip, while her husband decides to enact a stranger rape fantasy. While Jesse half-heartedly goes along with it in the beginning, she later becomes disturbed and asks Gerald to stop. This infuriates the man, who blames her for not having the energy to rekindle their relationship. However, before he can uncuff her, he suffers a heart attack and dies on top of her, leaving her trapped in her cuffs. The dog from earlier comes into the house and inside their room and takes a bite out of Gerald's arm. Jessie starts to hallucinate and sees a vision of Gerald and herself, and it's here that her real torture begins when she's faced with the demons she'd been suppressing all her life. Gerald's vision tells her that the dog will come for her once it finishes eating his dead body, unless she can find a way to get out of the cuffs and escape. Jessie has flashbacks from her childhood, which reveal how she was sexually abused by her father and ended up marrying Gerald, a man just like him. Amidst all this, a man comes into the room, and Jessie isn't sure at first if he's real or a hallucination, but it later turns out that he was an extremely dangerous serial killer. Jessie realizes after a while that self-mutilation is the only way she can escape and thus live. The movie deals with how she comes face to face with her suppressed emotions and finally gets out of the cuff. The film has received positive reviews, with people praising Carla Gugino's Jessie as a career-defining performance. Stephen King had called the film horrifying, hypnotic, and terrific. Since the whole movie basically revolves around Jessie being tied to the bedpost, you'd think that stretching it to over an hour would be a tedious and boring watch. However, it's anything but that. The seamless way in which the plot progresses takes away from the fact that all of this is being thought of by a woman who's chained to a bed and has nothing better to do. The creepiness and paranoia that comes with being isolated and immobile is something that's almost never explored or even considered as something horrific, and the film does an amazing job of explaining just how scary this can be. Despite the small number of characters and fairly little action, the movie progressed well and never made the audience feel bored. The fractured psyche of Jessie's character is explored on a very deep level, and many people have reportedly felt an eerie closeness with her life and experiences as a woman. That being said, some people believe the hype about the movie is somewhat overrated, because essentially it's the acting of the cast that carries the film. Some scenes were quite cringy and could have been executed in a better fashion. Gerald's Game is an unnerving and very frightening account of what can happen to any of us if we were in a similar situation as Jessie. Ouija, Origin of Evil, 2016. If you think Gerald's Game is one of Mike Flanagan's best works, well, wait until you check out Ouija, Origin of Evil. The movie is set in Los Angeles in 1967, where a family mourning the loss of a father ends up in a dangerous game of Ouija and gets entangled with spirits. Alice has two children, Lena and Doris. The family is mourning their father Roger, who'd passed away recently. Alice works as a spiritual medium and incorporates a Ouija board into her readings to get in touch with her husband's spirit. However, they encounter a spirit named Marcus instead, and it begins to possess Doris. At first, Doris is also under the impression that she's communicating with her father, especially when the spirit directs her to some money when the family faces a tough financial crisis. Alice notices this and uses the board to check the answer to a question that only Roger would know, and is thrilled to receive the correct solution. Thus, she also believes that they're communicating with Roger. The spirit, however, starts to completely possess Doris, who writes papers in fluent Polish, a language she doesn't know at all. Troubled at this, Lena contacts her school's principal, Father Tom Hogan, who joins the family for a session to understand what's happening. Marcus the spirit was a Polish immigrant who was taken captive by a sadistic doctor during the Second World War, who would do crude experiments on him and other people imprisoned in the home's basement. These spirits have been watching the family all their life. When all hell breaks loose, the Ouija board is destroyed and Father Hogan finds the room where the experiments were conducted, but is killed by Doris, who also kills her mother's new boyfriend. Lena has to make sure to keep everyone in her family safe, but there's no way to save them all. The movie had a prequel which wasn't received very well by critics. However, this sequel ended up getting significantly more positive reception than its predecessor. When Alice's scam business takes a sinister turn with the incorporation of the Ouija board, it gives the spirits a chance to finally do their ill bidding on the most sensitive and impressionable people in the family. The cast has done a great job, and while there were not many jump scares through the film, they were timed well. The cinematography is extremely elegant, and Flanagan doesn't waste any effort on cheap scare tactics like sudden noises to scare the audience. Instead, he creates an environment where the viewers will feel a chill quite naturally with the way the whole Ouija board thing pans out. There's nothing excessive in the movie and virtually no gore, but it still manages to be a very entertaining watch because it targets that region of consciousness that deals with paranoia. The backstory of the spirit named Marcus is an added touch that gives meaning to the malevolent nature of the spirits. However, some people have criticized the film for being overly simplistic. Many of them were disinclined because the film's predecessor did a fairly bad job at the box office, and while they agree that this was an improvement, there could have been so much more with the possession subgenre. All in all, yeah, a creepy watch, but certainly not the creepiest. Apostle 2018. Cult horror is a different level of creepy. Blood sacrifices and sexual rituals and whatnot. Midsommar is one of the most well-known names in this category, but did you know about a similar movie named Apostle? The theme of paganism versus organized religion is subtly depicted here, along with greed and lust. In 1905, Thomas travels to a remote island in Wales to rescue his sister, Jennifer, who was kidnapped and held captive by a strange cult. Thomas disguises himself as a convert and meets the leader of the cult, Malcolm, along with his co-founders, Frank and Quinn. They say that the island was originally barren, but became increasingly fertile through blood sacrifice, and as such, blood is required to maintain the fertility and prosperity of the people of the island. Frank and Quinn's children are in a relationship. Thomas gets it out of them that Jennifer was forcibly held for ransom, since the cult doesn't have the kind of money to continuously afford the animal sacrifices that take place there. Thomas finds out that the island has a reigning deity who is imprisoned by Malcolm and is fed blood and flesh so that the vegetation of the island prosper. In the meantime, Quinn's daughter ends up being pregnant and is mutilated by her father when he forces her to abort. Frank's son Jeremy intervenes but is publicly slaughtered by Quinn, who frames him for killing his daughter. An enraged Frank attacks Quinn, and amidst this, Thomas is able to escape. Earlier, he tells Malcolm's daughter Andrea that he was persecuted in China for trying to spread Christianity and had lost his faith. The cult leaders, after discovering the powers of the deity, had intended to offer blood sacrifices to it by raping and having children with the captive women. In a fierce fight, Thomas, Jennifer, and Andrea must find a way to escape the island. The deity also begs Thomas to set her free from the cult's hold over her. However, without the deity, the island would once again become barren and uninhabitable. The underlying Lovecraftian theme strongly resembles The Wicker Man, which also deals with cult horror. The film is quite well made with genuine elements of horror and gore which only enhance the overall creepy nature of the setting. The cinematography is absolutely top-notch, and the location of the island is extremely beautiful, as it always is with cult horror setting. The theme of Christianity versus paganism is a somewhat conflicted theme in the film, especially since it shows in the end how Thomas's faith wins despite all odds. Michael Sheen does an amazing job as Malcolm, and his eerie and creepy portrayal carries the film. Critics, however, point out to the plot hole surrounding the character of the Grinder, which appears out of nowhere and doesn't really serve a very meaningful purpose. The depiction of the deity of the island also received mixed responses from viewers, as they believe someone associated with fertility and prosperity should have looked a certain way. Well, in conclusion, if you like Midsommar, there's no reason why you wouldn't like Apostle. Evil Dead Rise 2023. If you're the kind of person who loves depraved imagery imagery in horror movies, well, you'll certainly enjoy this one. Part of the Evil Dead franchise, Evil Dead Rise deals with creature horror as well as possession horror, and all in all, does a brilliant job at portraying gore and blood. Definitely do not watch this while snacking. Beth finds out that she's pregnant and is deeply upset by it, so she visits her sister Ellie, who lives in a condemned Los Angeles apartment with her kids Danny, Bridget, and Cassie. An earthquake occurs when the kids are in the basement parking lot, which unearths a secret chamber. Danny explores it and finds religious tools, some old vinyls from the 1920s, and a volume of the legendary Book of the Dead. The records explain a priest's journey into finding the remaining volumes of the book, but also spell out an ancient incantation that can summon creatures known as the Deadites. While the power in the building goes out, Ellie appears to be possessed by something and becomes increasingly menacing before finally dying and asking Beth to protect her children. The neighbors try to find a way to get out of the building, but Ellie reanimates and goes on a killing frenzy. Danny confesses about finding the dreaded book, and Beth realizes that the only way to stop the Deadites is to completely demolish the host. As Ellie's killing frenzy continues, she manipulates her children into opening up to her in an attempt to kill them. Slowly, the bodies of all the dead people become possessed as the number of the survivors become lesser. Somehow, it appears that the Deadites can be transmitted from people, because even after the survivors make it out safely, another person is possessed and the cycle seemingly continues. Now, the reviews for this movie are somewhat mixed, because a lot of people appreciate the gore factor while agreeing that the story in itself lacks structure and proper pace. Mostly, it's the gruesome brutality of the franchise that makes fans of horror flock to watch this movie, as the scenes are both disgusting and ingenious at times. It appears to most critics that the filmmakers try to appeal to a younger audience with this addition to the franchise, but on some level it fell short on the execution. The dialogues were decent enough, and camera work was great, but somewhere the acting of the cast missed the mark. Even with a genre like horror, there's more to portray than just meaningless fear, which was the main problem with the acting. The body horror was certainly on point, but overall, the movie lacked luster and could have been much more well-rounded, especially considering the special effects were fantastic. Marvelous verdict: these 12 titles are available on Netflix, a great way to kickstart your Halloween holidays. There's something for everyone. You have creature horror, extreme gore, psychological horror, the horror of practical and social commentary, as well as cults and creepy ways. While it can be argued that not all the films on this list are mainstream works of horror and / or gore, all of them are very creative and diverse works which certainly deserve a watch at least once. From classics like Psycho to more nuanced works like The Platform, Netflix has a collection of truly commendable movies that won't fail to entertain. Which of these movies do you think deserves the title of the best horror movie on Netflix? Let us know in the comments. Till then, take care and stay tuned.